Our conference will begin with the address of our esteemed keynote speaker. Our keynote speaker is a public anthropologist, a film critic and film educator, and a writer. As a researcher, he has conducted fieldworks on the following themes: status and cultures and transitions of Indo-Chinese refugees and the Philippine Refugee Processing Center, social meanings of Minka or Japanese farmhouses, and the Japayuki phenomenon and the Filipino migration to Japan. He developed a course on Japanese cinema in the Japanese Studies program of the Ateneo de Manila University, where he taught courses on Japanese cinema culture, literature, and Philippine-Japan relations for many years until his retirement. He co-edited two books with Dr. Hiroko Nagai, War Memories, Monuments and Media, Representations of Conflicts and Creation of Histories of World War II, Japanese Studies Program, Ateneo de Manila University, and Transnationalizing Culture of Japan in Asia, Dramas, Musics, Arts, Agencies, both released by the Japanese Studies Program through the Ateneo de Manila University Press. Our keynote speaker is a member of the Manunuri ng Pelikulang Pilipino or Critics of the Filipino Film, the oldest and the most prestigious film critics circle in the country, in which he once served as its chair. He has lectured on films and conducted workshops on film education and film criticism. He has also served as jury in many film festivals. He is a columnist for Business Mirror, where he maintains two columns, Reeling, which is on film and mass media, and Annotations, which is on societies and cultures. He is the resident art and media critic of the Savage Mind Book Cinema in Naga City. In 2015, he was awarded by the Union of Writers of the Philippines or UMPIL the Gawad Sining ni Balagtas for achievement in English essay. To discuss to us teaching human rights through the arts, a creative, critical culture-based approach, please welcome Professor Tito Genova Valiente.
Good morning, everyone. The title of this talk, if I may call it a title, is Observing, Understanding, Negating Cultures, Upholding Rights as Humans. Two tasks were given to me this morning to define culture and human rights. I call them tasks in the literal sense of it. The word in medieval Latin is related to taxare, which means to censure, gawain in our own language. This connotes labor, a work that brings with it a struggle. I'm also given some 20 minutes to develop this assignment under the title, Teaching Human Rights Through the Arts, a Creative, Critical, Culture-Based Pedagogy. Along the way, I need to deal with how much we can offer ways to teach human rights through a pedagogy that is creative and critical, culture-based. With that as the overarching title of my talk, I jumped at the opportunity to expound on this beast called cultural education, which I will grapple with without even knowing how strong or weak or devious the monster is. Cultural education for a doubter like me is a suspect. Welcome to this conference with the theme Rethinking and Reimagining Philippine Culture-Based Education, Critical Engagement, Effective Investment, Decolonial Practice. From perhaps the apprehension that you may have sensed above, I shift now to a welcoming voice. There is a reason for this. A critical approach to culture or cultural studies is the only way for us to survive a talk about a concept that we often talk about, but never stop, or rarely pause to question, subvert, or even negate. That critique should eventually lead us to a solution, the act of decolonization. There is the most difficult part, the affective sphere, ang pagtuturo ng pagmamahal. Defining love in the anthropological sense, or caring, I have mastered. Doing it is ideological. I leave that to you, cultural workers, artists, teachers, lovers of arts. Let me begin with the boring part, defining human rights. Why do I call it boring? It is not because I am diminishing the concept and the acts of human rights. It is important, but in an ideal world, there must be no need to define it. It should be there. It should act upon itself, upon us. Regarding human rights, I go to Thomas Paine, the philosopher and political activist, who said, man has existed before any government. Makikita kay Thomas Paine ang kahalagahan ng kalayaan ng bawat mamamayan, na sa atin nanggagaling ang kapangyarihan ng pamahalaan. Para kay Thomas Paine, governments must have arisen either of the people or over the people. With human rights, there must be freedom, and this freedom is imbued in all of us. Thomas Paine wrote common sense, which we now, students of culture, should appreciate, because for the first time in modern times, a philosopher wrote his ideas in words and sentences that could be grasped by many. We can appreciate this work more if we go to the philosophy of Thomas Paine, where he articulated the principle that a man, or a woman, if I may add, even if he has no property, has a right to vote. Reading this now, at present, the principle sounds common. But imagine these words in the 19th century, when slavery was still prevalent. Then you understand how radical common sense the book and the concept is. With human rights, we come upon another idea and another ideal, universalism, that human right principles can be applied to everyone. What happens when culture enters the picture? What happens when a different culture is talked about? For Thomas Paine, the most formidable weapon against any errors of every kind is reason. This thinker is noted for saying, once the mind is enlightened, it will never seek or go back to darkness again. Herein lies the spirit of education. Thus, education can never fail. Indeed, what is the role of culture in human rights? The question is not an investigation into stasis, yung hindi gumagalaw, but a query into the dynamics between human rights and cultures. I am talking and will continue to talk of cultures in the plural, never in the singular, monolithic, unchanging, monumental definition that has ruled our world as thinking people. There is no such phenomenon as Philippine culture. There are Philippine cultures, as there are Philippine societies, not Philippine society. As there are values or systems of values, not necessarily agreeing with each other, perhaps intervening, perhaps overlapping, but almost always contending, dialoguing with each other, sometimes dominating, oftentimes tolerating. Now, this should bring us to the next task at hand. How do we define culture? Its variations, forms, and manifestations in the fields. Note that for me, cultures are located. They may be imagined, but there are always sites by which you could apprehend cultures. And more than that, propound investigation that where there are cultures, then this question comes up. Can we find there embedded an understanding of human rights? Here we can start to pose this most common question. Do cultures reflect the notions and actions of human rights? That question is old, outdated, incomplete. We should focus on these points of examination. Number one, do cultures refract human rights? Do cultures subvert human rights? Do cultures negate human rights? Do cultures affirm human rights? Do cultures work against human rights? We can even popularize our inquest and ask, are Philippine cultures friendly to human rights? The point in all this is not to fall into the trap of one-to-one correspondence where we say, here is culture and there is human right. Now, let us find the relationship between the two. Let me go to the business of culture. This is for me the more interesting aspect of this session, the definition of culture per se. Culture is an anthropological enterprise. Going through the modules on cultural education that are all over online, there seems to be one definition that best answers the spirit of the said kind of integration. This is E.B. Tyler's classic definition of culture, which says culture or civilization, taken in its wide ethnographic sense, is that complex whole which includes knowledge, belief, art, morals, law, custom, and any other capabilities and habits acquired by man as a member of society. The definition is ancient, taken as it was from the English anthropologist's book, Primitive Culture, written in 1871. It is a definition that is wholly characterized by a culture, singular, that is evolutionary, but at the same time static at each stage. In that book, society is pictured as a totality, which cannot correspond to a real society where conflicts are not only natural, but needed to generate the dynamism for growth and identity. Let me share with you a book I have read, Charles King's Gods of the Upper Air, How a Circle of Renegade Anthropologists Reinvented Race, Sex, and Gender in the 20th Century. The book is compelling and entertaining because, as cultural educators would discover, the study of cultures is compelling and fun. Charles King writes, and I quote, "On board Sonoma was a 23-year-old Pennsylvanian, slight but square-built, unable to swim, given to conjunctivitis. She had left behind a husband and a boyfriend in Chicago and had spent the transcontinental train ride in the arms of a woman," unquote. This young woman would turn out to be everyone's idea of an ideal anthropologist. She is Margaret Mead. Charles King continues, "She could not have known," meaning Margaret Mead, "at the time, but there among the welcoming feasts and the reef fishing on humid afternoons and in the lashing winds of a tropical storm, Mead was in the middle of a revolution. It had begun with a set of vexing questions at the heart of philosophy, religion, and of the human sciences. What are the natural divisions of human society? Is morality universal? How should we treat people whose beliefs and habits are different from our own?" Let me go to another book written by a geographer, strictly speaking, not an anthropologist, who studied the Philippines. The name is Benedict J. Kerfleet, and the book is Everyday Politics in the Philippines. In the introduction, Kerfleet does not begin with a theory. He begins with a story. And this is the story. Screams broke in the evening stillness of San Ricardo. Neighbors emerging from their houses to investigate found Lita Zamora ranting in the middle of the graveled highway that passes through the village. She was a dim figure, lit only by faint glows from houses lining the road. In her long skirt and with her hair bouncing above her shoulders, as she gesticulated and stomped up and down, sending up small clouds of dust, she appeared more like a spirit than a 34-year-old mother of four. "Okay, kill me, I'm not afraid. Who are they anyway?" From the shadows of trees and houses, perhaps 70 pairs of eyes followed her movements. No one spoke, yet a consensus prevailed to let her vent her emotions. That story carefully calls Lita's political statement. Here is a scholar doing a study of politics in the Philippine village, and he is not carrying with him the huge Western concepts of, for example, social inequality and dependency paradigm. Rather, he looks at the ordinary occurrences, the everyday life in the village. And while he still employs a concept developed in the academic laboratories, this time the conceptualization comes very close to home, the notion of everyday resistance. That for certain classes of people, resistance does not come through lobbying or making representations in the halls of legislation and execution, but doing little things, nuances of rebellion and rage, subtle disagreement with what is present in their midst, poverty, oppression, being taken advantage of, helplessness in the face of an uncaring government. In Lita's case, the rant, a pagwawala in their neighborhood, is a political statement. The next day, people wakes up seemingly having forgotten what occurred the previous night. But at least a voice was heard. A tiny seed, scared, has been planted in the community. What is the lesson in this dramatic story about Lita? That those disciplines most of us here have mastered, political science, education, psychology, history, and many more, and yes, sociology and anthropology, cannot promise to crystallize for us the social realities where we are active as human beings. Through the years, these academic skills and the methodologies developed with them have obscured, obfuscated our dreams and images as a people. Perhaps we should look at methodology and fieldwork. At the core of human rights is equality. And at the heart of equality, both the concept and reality, is our mission to locate it in the cultures of the social unit we're looking into. A classroom, an office, a government institution, a village, and between individuals. Fayuna Bawi, in her introduction to the chapter on sex, gender, and the sacred in the book Anthropology of Religion, says, the myth of equality in Western societies disguises the extent to which sex and gender remain key organizing principles. When men and women compare experiences, however, or when confronted with statistical information, it becomes clear that whether we are born male or female profoundly affects the choices, opportunities, and view of the world we will have throughout life. Bowie, in the same chapter, would tell us women were never absent from the ethnographic record, but their lives were filtered through and interpreted by men. Recall the surveys that we use every day when we enter homes and we ask for the head of the family. We are never interested in women. We are interested in what the men would say. How do we use ethnographies, the description of cultures, what we consider as a reliable source of information about cultures when they come from very limited sources? Will the status of women change if we also change our definition of culture? Let us look at Ward Goodenough's concept of culture in 1981. A society's culture consists of whatever it is one has to know or believe in order to operate in a manner acceptable to its members. How do we rate the acceptability of women in our society? Goodenough continues. Culture is not a material phenomenon. It does not consist of things, people, behavior, or emotions. It is rather an organization of these things, It is the forms of things that people have in mind, their models for perceiving, relating, and otherwise interpreting them. That's Ward Goodenough speaking in his book, Cultural Anthropology and Linguistics. Still a limited way of looking at culture, but we see there an opportunity to use this definition in a pedagogical setting, in that act of organizing. Here is where we can attempt at decolonization. Given our cultural background, the Spanish additives, yung mga nadagdag, or remnants, yung mga naiwan, are still strong in our societies. We take pride always in our Spanish heritage, and that we need to rethink. I am not talking of religion because it's not my ambition here to proselytize, but to underscore this natural option in our mind to go Spanish always. When we set up museums and other problematic Western structures, we tend to call it always Museo de whatever, even if the artifacts inside are not necessarily Spanish colonization related. In the process, we have developed this unhealthy necrophilia love for ruins. And from ruins, I believe, rise more museums. Now, don't get me wrong, I value museums. I studied museology in Japan, where I worked in so-called living museums. These are farmhouses transported from the original site into a park setting. Farmhouses are called minka. The result is an intelligent version of a theme park where Japanese and non-Japanese could learn about native concepts of spaces, sumptuary laws, the law on consumption. There was a law prohibiting prefectures or provinces to copy structures from one another, and the relationship between ecology and culture. Houses were shaped in such a way that the cold wind is funneled and made warm through an extension of the building, and so on. What we need, I believe, is a living appreciation of our culture, not merely the artifactual, not the study of artifacts. We cannot go on celebrating cultures by asking our students to dress up as Bagobo or Tindian and assume they have developed cultural rootedness. Culture is not a habiliment or a dress you put on and remove once the need is not present. We cannot be approaching identities by mixing all the available designs and colors of cultural communities and declare we have nurtured the splendor of multiculturalism. There are viable ways. Cultures are rooted in languages. We can experiment with dance songs, not by asking our dancers to dance the dance or sing the folk songs, but study the content of the dances. How are women personified in the dance? How are men depicted in dances? I am a lover of old songs, those sentimental, romantic songs popularized by Ruben Tagalog, Celi Bautista, Carmen Camacho, Sinon Lagman, and many other forgotten cultural personalities. Examine the lyrics and do a study of gender. You know what? We are like the Japanese who have the enka. These are ultra melodramatic songs whose persona is that of a woman, but sung by men. In our Kundiman, there is that interchangeability of the victim and victimizer. Recall to mind the song Marupok na Sumpa, which goes from some lines, sumumpa kang ako ang iibigin at ang pagsuyo mo'y di magmamaliw. Sa init ng halik, nagtiwala ko sa iyong pag-ibig. Now recall that being sung by a man, then play it with your heart being invoked by a woman and see the difference. What was happening in the 50s? Was romance freer in those years? Did music transcend realities to make the difficult acceptable? With both the sexes, the man, the woman, complicit in the illusion? Consider cosmology, and this is something that we do not want to touch, okay? The philosopher, also anthropologist, Freya Matthews posits, and I quote, a cosmology, depiction of the universe, serves to orient a community to its world in the sense that it defines for the community in question the place of humankind in the cosmic scheme of things. Such cosmic orientation tells the members of the community in the broadest possible terms who they are and where they stand in relation to the rest of creation. Unquote. There begins the possibility of decolonization as we look at the myths and rituals around us. Why, may I ask, are there ceremonies where women are not allowed and men are dominant? Why are there meets where women became the source of the curse inflicted upon the world or a village? Cannot this be changed? Investigate our so-called epics. In Ibalon, the Bicol epic, which I doubt is authentic, Oriol, the woman, appears as a serpent and is often depicted as the enemy of heroes. If our pre-Spanish histories tell us of women occupying a status of prominence, then why are all the heroes in the Bicol epic male? Think about that, no? In the latest documentary on the Moriones made by Ruel Wang Manipon, there are women already performing as Morion. In the end, it is not the definitions of cultures that are at fault, but the disciplines which we subject our pedagogical lens to. In our field, ethnography as an approach is already being questioned, while anthropology itself as a science is being questioned. Can a researcher really bracket his own thoughts when he does field work? Can we remain as neutral observers? Reflexive research could be an answer, where knowledge is intersubjective, where the description of cultures is a dialogue between individuals and cultures, between an anthropologist and the subject being studied. Culture, after all, is not always constructive. It can be destructive, like the cultures of poverty, the cultures of impunity, the cultures that declare women should be muted, maging pipi. The task will not be easy. It is like the journey of the proverbial hero, where in the quest he or she meets oppositions and in return to the classroom goes through what Maurice Bloch calls rebounding violence. Will there be closure in the search for teaching through cultures? I doubt it. As colonized bodies, we will remain suspended between the false glory of the past and the dreamy, facile capture of a reinventing future. But there's the hope, not reinvented, but reinventing and recovering future. Thank you and good morning.